Antinatalism is a term and a philosophy that more and more people are hearing about and looking into. But I think a lot of people misunderstand what it actually is and make a knee-jerk judgment of it where it isn't warranted. Now, before we get into this video properly, I want to clarify that this video is about antinatalism, not necessarily about antinatalists. I'm going to be talking about 5 misconceptions about antinatalism, but these may not be misconceptions about certain antinatalists. These may in fact be accurate for some antinatalists, but that isn't what this video is about. This video is about the philosophy itself. So let's get into it. Number 1 is that antinatalism is depression masquerading as a philosophy. Now, whilst this one is untrue, I can understand why people have this reaction. The average person is extremely used to life affirmation, and antinatalism and philosophical pessimism, which is often discussed at the same time as antinatalism, both tend to focus on the harms of coming into existence and the unfortunate circumstances that we find ourselves in. So you can see why the average person, upon making contact with antinatalism for potentially the first time, is going to maybe have a shock to their system. And it is also the case that there are some depressed antinatalists. So you can understand this reaction that someone may have to antinatalism as being over-intellectualized depression. But looking into antinatalism just a little bit more will make you realize that this really isn't the case. Someone, and I include myself in this group of people, can be perfectly happy with the set of circumstances they are in currently, given the fact that they exist, but intellectually recognize that it would have been better never to have come into existence. When someone gets this impression of antinatalism being over-intellectualized depression, they really need to focus on the substance of what is being said and the philosophy itself, rather than psychologizing the person that is conveying the message. And quickly, there's another similar brand of this reaction, which is that antinatalism is nihilism. Now, when people use the term nihilism in this context, I think the most reasonable interpretation of what they're saying is that antinatalism just doesn't care about anything. It doesn't value anything. But this just isn't true. Of course, antinatalism stems from care and moral concern. Otherwise, why would someone hold an opposition to bringing new sentient beings into existence? They have to care about something to be compelled to take that position in the first place. And in the case of antinatalism, it is the care and concern for the being who may be brought into existence. Number 2, antinatalism is misanthropic. And when I say misanthropic here, I mean a dislike or hatred for humanity. Now, don't get me wrong, there are many antinatalists who do have a dislike for humanity, given the horrors they observe humanity perpetuating. And this isn't the case for just antinatalists. There are many groups of people that have a vein of misanthropy running through them. And we do have to remember that there's a mature form of misanthropy that can be held here. And that's a misanthropy that recognizes the horrors and the evil that humanity as a whole are capable of, or even humans as individuals are capable of, but that in everyday life, each human is taken as they are. But anyway, back to antinatalism. Antinatalism itself doesn't stem from misanthropy or a disdain for humans. It stems fundamentally from a concern for sentient beings, including humans, and the harms they'll be exposed to by being brought into existence. But I can understand why someone would come to this conclusion that antinatalism is misanthropic, because one of the categories of argument for antinatalism is referred to as the misanthropic argument. Perhaps most well known is the misanthropic argument for antinatalism, a chapter by David Benatar in the book Permissible Progeny, The Morality of Procreation and Parenting. However, what is meant by misanthropic arguments here are arguments for antinatalism that concern the harms that will be done or could be done by the individual being brought into existence, as opposed to the harms done to them. This is separate from a misanthropic disdain for humanity. It's a simple recognition for the harm that we're capable of doing. In fact, Benatar references this in his chapter. The arguments that will be advanced here are misanthropic only in the sense that they point to unpleasant facts about humans. Accepting these arguments does not commit one to hating humans. Indeed, I shall argue that the misanthropic arguments are not incompatible with the philanthropic ones. Thus, the characterization of the arguments as misanthropic should not be taken too literally or overinterpreted. Another flavour of this misconception is that antinatalism hate children specifically. Now, I won't go into this in detail here because I've made a whole separate video on why antinatalism doesn't equal child hatred, called Why It Makes No Sense to Hate Kids as an Antinatalist. I've linked that in the description below so you can check out the whole video, but suffice to say, antinatalism views children as the victims in the act of procreation. So it would make no sense for antinatalists to hate or antinatalism to encourage hatred or stem from hatred towards the very beings that it's concerned about. Number 3 is antinatalism is pro-death And another flavor of this is that antinatalism believes life is so horrible, or it promotes the idea that life is so horrible, that it would be better to exit it as soon as possible. This is wrong on a number of levels. In my video, Why Antinatalists Don't Kill Themselves, linked below, I talk about this in more detail, but I'll give an overview now. In short, there's a difference between starting a life and continuing one, and antinatalism is only concerned with the starting of lives. Deciding to start a life is done by one person to another. Continuing a life is a decision made by the person who will be continuing their own life. And also, deciding to start a life is done where there is no one to want to come into existence. But continuing a life is done where there is someone who already exists and wants to continue living. These are completely different situations. Just because someone views a situation, i.e. existence, as being better never to have been brought into, doesn't mean they want to exit this situation as soon as possible or force others to exit it as well. Again, more information in the video in the description. Now, one way that death does actually concern antinatalism is that if you view death as a harm, that is then one of the harms of coming into existence, that the being you're bringing into existence will die. This only strengthens the case for antinatalism. And in this way, antinatalism is closer to being anti-death than pro-death, because you can't have death without birth. Number 4, antinatalism is about not having children. Now, this is a pretty reasonable misconception, because I think a lot of people will think antinatalism means obviously you're not going to have children. But being antinatalist and being child-free are actually two different things. Being one doesn't imply you're the other. Although, of course, in practice, there is a large overlap between the antinatalist community and the child-free community. Again, I've done a video on this topic called The Difference Between Being Antinatalist and Child-Free. So if you want more detail, you can find that in the description. But in short, being an antinatalist, you're opposed to bringing new sentient beings into existence. But this doesn't mean that you haven't had your own kids already, or that you find a partner who's had a kid already, or that you adopt. Likewise, if you're child-free, this simply means you don't have any children. It doesn't mean you view coming into existence as a harm, or that you have any specific views about other people procreating. You can be child-free for financial and lifestyle reasons, which has nothing to do with antinatalism, and you can adopt because you want to raise a child but you're ethically opposed to procreation, and this has nothing to do with being child-free. Misconception number 5 is that antinatalism is authoritarian, and there's a recent brand of this which is that antinatalism is part of a World Economic Forum depopulation agenda. You can see this recent form of the misconception from the likes of Awaken with JP and Paul Joseph Watson. I've done reaction videos to both of them on this topic, so you can find those in the description. But anyway, antinatalism and authoritarianism. Antinatalism is simply the view that it is a harm to come into existence, and as a result, it is unethical to create new sentient beings. This doesn't imply any form of authoritarianism. Of course, I understand why people's minds go here, because there is a history of governments and other groups using authoritarian means to put in place some form of population control, but these instances had nothing to do with antinatalist philosophy. And of course, you'll find some people on Reddit too advocating for authoritarian antinatalist measures, but this is distinct from the philosophy. Just because you're opposed to something doesn't mean you want to achieve a cessation of it by authoritarian means, and it doesn't mean that you would impose authoritarian measures even if you had the power to do so. In fact, the most prominent contemporary philosopher on antinatalism, who I've mentioned before, David Benatar, devotes a whole section in his book, Better Never to Have Been, on distinguishing antinatalism from authoritarian legal policies. I have shown that a legal right to procreative freedom is well justified in our actual world, where the alternative involves appalling state invasions of privacy and bodily intrusions. My liberal instincts are troubled by the case of a society where all or almost all procreation could be prevented without such costs by involuntary and imperceptible contraception. And he adds a footnote which says, I also have strong instincts that allowing people to cause suffering is wrong. These instincts pull in the opposite direction. Being authoritarian is a separate belief or tendency added on top of one's opposition to something. Just because someone may be opposed to the existence of extreme poverty, for example, doesn't mean that they want to achieve eradicating extreme poverty by authoritarian means. These are simply separate things. Someone may be one or the other, or they may be both, but one isn't necessarily linked to the other. So those are 5 misconceptions that I see people having about antinatalism. Let me know if I've missed any misconceptions in the comments below, or if you had these as a misconception about antinatalism, and I'll see you in the next one.